Welcome to Jewish Insights for the SIYUM HARAMBAM. SIYUM HARAMBAM comes across, it's two Hebrew terms. What does this stuff mean? Let's talk about it for a moment. That'll be the introduction for our class. Right after Passover in 1984, the Rebbe initiated a massive campaign that would shake the world of Torah study in a crazy way. The Rebbe said that in order to achieve specific outcomes, which we'll discuss throughout the class, every person, man, woman, and child, should engage in learning the entire Torah. Engage in learning the entire Torah. So now the question is, how am I going to manage? How am I going to get to learning the entire Torah? The Torah is huge, and there's so much information. How can I, a simple man, a regular person, how can I get through the whole thing? And the Rebbe's solution was learn the Rambam's magnum opus called the Mishnah Torah, and he divided it into three different cycles. Each cycle slightly different, so that anyone could participate on their level. Now, until this point, people had been using the Rambam's magnum opus, the Mishnah Torah, but it wasn't like the popular book of the century. It was for scholars. It was for the for the codifiers. It wasn't for the simple man, for the regular Jew. But as the Rebbe instituted this method of study, so the Rambam suddenly became so much more accessible and so much more useful for the individual. So let's jump straight in to section A, called a second to the Torah. And the premise we're going to discover soon is that the Rambam calls his book Mishnah Torah. Mishnah Torah means second to. It's like a vice Torah. It's the second to the Torah. All you need is the 5 books of Moses, or maybe the Tanakh, and then once you're done with that, you can skip everything else, and get straight into the Maimonides book, the Rambam. Let's read source number 1, and what we'll do is we'll ask Rabbi Shmuel, can you read for us, please, the entire source number 1. There's each paragraph will have a little introduction, but and so I'll jump in, but you can please read for us the entire thing.
Moses, our teacher, personally transcribed the entire Torah before he died. He gave a Torah scroll to each tribe and placed another scroll in the ark as a testimonial. As Deuteronomy states, take this Torah scroll and place it beside the ark, and it will be there as a testimonial. The mitzvah, i.e. the explanation of the Torah, he did not transcribe. Instead, he commanded it verbally to the elders, to Joshua, and to the totality of Israel. As Deuteronomy states, be careful to observe everything that I prescribe to you. For this reason, it is called the oral law.
Excellent. Okay, so what do we see? Moshe Rabbeinu writes for every tribe their own copy of the Torah scroll. Each tribe is meant to hold this with themselves wherever they may hold it. There's another Torah which is kept in the ark, but there's something that runs parallel to the written Torah. There's a written Torah, 5 books of Moses, and then there is the oral Torah. And the Rambam, his comment here, tells us that from the text, you understand that there must be this parallel supply of information. There must be this parallel thing. And now we're going to talk about how that gets developed. So, over the coming millennium, after the Torah is given, so there turns up this form of transmission, how the Torah is going to be passed on from each generation to generation. We start with the 5 books of Moses, but we always need to have an interpretation, and that interpretation needs to be endorsed. And how do we get to the interpretation? Reb Shmuel.
From the days of Moses, our teacher, until our holy rabbi, Yehuda the Prince, no one composed a text for the purpose of teaching the oral law in public. Instead, in each generation, the head of the court or the prophet of that generation would take notes of the teachings which he received from his masters for himself and teach them verbally in public. He collected all the teachings, laws, explanations, and commentaries that were heard from Moses, our teacher, and which were taught by the courts in each generation concerning the entire Torah. From all these, he composed the text of the Mishnah. He taught it in public and revealed it to the Jewish people, who all wrote it down. They spread it in all places so that the oral law would not be forgotten by the Jewish people. Why did our holy Rabbi Yehuda the Prince make such an innovation instead of perpetuating the status quo? Because he saw the students becoming fewer, new difficulties constantly arising, the evil empire spreading itself throughout the world and becoming more powerful, and the Jewish people wandering and becoming dispersed to the far ends of the world. Therefore, he composed a single text that would be available to everyone, so that it could be studied quickly and would not be forgotten. Throughout his entire life, he and his court taught the Mishnah to the masses.
Okay, so what do we have? Number one, we have the Mishnah. The Mishnah was compiled and written down by Rabbi Yehuda the Prince, who was Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, and he was the leader of the Jewish people in the 2nd century. And this is the first time ever that the oral Torah is being written down, and it's a big deal. The Talmud says, "How dare you? How could you?" And the answer is times call for it, and that's kind of what the Rambam says in the previous 2 paragraphs. But what we discover is that the time calls for it, and not only that, we actually continue to transcribe the oral Torah for many happy years to come. Reb Shmuel.
Rav composed the Sifra and the Sifri to explain the sources for the Mishnah. Rabbi Chia composed the Tosefta to explain the subjects discussed in the Mishnah. Rabbi Hoshea and Bar Kafra composed Baraisis to explain the matters discussed in the Mishnah. Rabbi Yochanan composed the Jerusalem Talmud in the land of Israel approximately 300 years after the destruction of the temple. And it was Rabbi Ashi who composed the Babylonian Talmud in Shinar, southwestern Mesopotamia, around 100 years after Rabbi Yochanan composed the Jerusalem Talmud. The intent of both the Talmuds is to elucidate the words of the Mishnah, to explain its deeper points, and to relate the new matters that were developed by each court from the era of our holy rabbi until the composition of the Talmud. From the entire body of knowledge stemming from the 2 Talmuds, the Tosefta, Sifra, and Sifri, can be derived the forbidden and the permitted, the impure and the pure, the liable and those who are free of liability, the invalid and the valid, as was received in tradition, one person from another, in a chain extending back to Moses at Mount Sinai. At this time, we have been beset by additional difficulties. Everyone feels financial pressure. The wisdom of our sages has become lost, and the comprehension of our men of understanding has become hidden. Therefore, those explanations, laws, and responsa, which the Gaonim composed and considered to be fully explained material, have become difficult to grasp in our age, and only a select few comprehend these matters in the proper way. Needless to say, there is confusion with regard to the Talmud itself, both the Jerusalem and Babylonian Talmuds, the Sifra, the Sifri, and Tosefta. But they require a breadth of knowledge, a spirit of wisdom, and much time for appreciating the proper path regarding what is permitted and forbidden, and the other laws of the Torah.
Okay, so what do we have? We have a problem. The Rambam is telling us a problem. What's the issue? The Rambam told us that there's so much information, there's so much content, there's so much to know. In order for a person to be a God-fearing, observant Jew, they must know so much information. And, by the way, it's not like you can manage to know information, a specific topic by reading one specific book. If you want to know certain laws, you might find it in one section of the Talmud. But then, if you want to know, step 3 of the same topic, you'll have to go to a completely different section of the Talmud where that was discussed, because it's not completely organized. Sometimes the Talmud says, we've already discussed this elsewhere. And that's what the Talmud says about itself, that it's poor in some areas and rich in the others. It's full, it's well discussed and well rehearsed, one area, but in another area it might not be. And so what's the issue? The issue is, in order to be a knowledgeable Jew, you've got to know everything. But that's like too big to ask from a normal person. And so the Rambam provides the following solution. And the Rambam's solution is that he is going to collect and organize all of the laws, all of the information that one needs to know. He'll organize it somewhat encyclopedia-like, where it'll be broken down by topics, and it'll be orderly. So you'll start with the basics and then progress through the depth of the law and then its ramifications in different areas. And hence the Rambam has this fantastically organized and orchestrated book, which becomes called the Mishnah Torah. Rabbi Shmuel, if you give us the next two paragraphs, we'll be able to see that inside.
Therefore I girded my loins, I, Moses, the son of Maimon, of Spain. I relied upon the rock, blessed be he. I contemplated all these texts and sought to compose a work which would include the conclusions derived from all these texts regarding the forbidden and the permitted, the impure and the pure, and the remainder of the Torah's laws, all in clear and concise terms, so that the entire oral law could be organized in each person's mouth without question or objections. Instead of arguments, this one claiming such and another such, this text will allow for clear and correct statements based on the judgments that result from all the texts and explanations mentioned above, from the days of our holy rabbi until the present. This compilation will make it possible for all the laws to be revealed to both those of lesser stature and those of greater stature, regarding every single mitzvah, and also all the practices that were ordained by the sages and the prophets. To summarize, the intent of this text is that a person will not need another text at all with regard to any Jewish law. Rather, this text will be a compilation of the entire oral law, including also the ordinances, customs, and decrees that were enacted from the time of Moses, our teacher, until the completion of the Talmud, as were explained by the Gaonim in the texts they composed after the Talmud. Therefore, I have called this text Mishnah Torah, the second to the Torah, with the intent that a person should first study the written law and then study this text and comprehend the entire oral law from it without having to study any other text between the two.
Excellent. Excellent. Rabbi Shmuel, you are a good reader. Thank you. What we have, so we've got the Rambam writing this book, encyclopedia-like, organized beginning to end. Everything is in there. And he calls it Mishnah Torah, the second to the Torah, which means that this book is just as good as, or nearly as good as Moses. This book is nearly as good as the 5 books of Moses. That's a massive statement. Well, there is a book called Seder HaDoros. Seder HaDoros translates as a chronology of generations. And in it, there is a comment which says that the author writes that he found in an older booklet the following statement. It said, Rabbeinu David the Nagid once said, in the name of his father Maimonides. So this, as a son of the Rambam, says that when the Rambam was writing his book, he stayed focused on it and he didn't engage in anything else. It says he stayed in his room and did not leave until he finished the compilation. The night, and how long? For 10 years he stayed in this room and didn't leave until it was done. On the night that he completed the work, the Rambam describes how he has a night vision. Yeah, I imagine it's a dream. He has a vision of his father, who had already passed away. His father comes to him with another person, and his father says, here is Moshe Rabbeinu. This is Moses. And Maimonides is shocked. And so the man says to Maimonides, I came to see what you've done. I came to see your achievement. The Rambam shows him his text, and Moshe Rabbeinu responds, thank you. Now, what happens? How did the world receive this text? So it actually turns out that some people were afraid that the Rambam's text would make the Talmud less popular, less necessary. Well, not only did that not happen, it actually made it a lot more necessary, because over time the Rambam's text was spread out amongst many, many different civilizations and nations and places, and cities and countries. In fact, the Rambam, who lives in Egypt, receives a letter from the scholars of France saying, your compilation has been received over here and we've been using it. But what also happens is that the Rambam becomes the Mishnah Torah becomes a fundamental part of the process of deciding on the application of Jewish law. If one wants to make a decision in Jewish law, they must take a look and understand the Rambam's view in order to come to their conclusion. And so it actually makes it more popular. Something else unique about the Rambam is that the Rambam, Maimonides, is going through all 613 commandments. So some halachic authors thought all they needed to talk about would be just the relevant laws. How do you put on tefillin? How do you keep Shabbos? How do you keep kosher? Etc. But what for the laws that are relevant only in the times of the temple? What for the laws that can only be kept when there is a Beis HaMikdash? What about the laws that are only relevant during the time of Hakel, which is a time of in the Beis HaMikdash only? What are we going to do? Who's going to tell us what to do? Who's going to tell us the laws about when Mashiach comes? Nobody writes about it. The only one who writes about it and makes decisions in this regard is Maimonides, in the Mishnah Torah, the 14 volumes of the Iyyar HaChazaka. Now, the whole world is engaged in this. The whole Jewish world is engaged in studying the Rambam on a daily basis in order to complete the Torah. But the question is, why did the Rebbe feel that it was a good idea that everyone should learn the Rambam, the Maimonides, the Mishnah Torah? It could have read anything else. Could have done the Talmud. Could have done something else. Why does it have to be why does it have to be the Mishnah Torah? There's two explanations. Number one is, when everybody gets together and studies the same thing on the same cycle, there is a unity that's generated that everyone is engaged in the exact same thing, especially by instruction of a Rebbe. And number two, every person has a personal obligation to complete studying the entire Torah. How do you complete studying the entire Torah? You've got to read so much stuff. Well, by learning the Mishnah Torah, which covers all the laws of the Torah for all the different topics, we're able, to some extent, to fulfill this mitzvah. Now, as it happens, from the day that the Rebbe initiated studying the Rambam, the Rebbe then made sure that at every Farbrengen, at every time that the Rebbe spoke, he included a comment from the Rambam of the day, from the period of time that we were studying, from the Rambam that was being studied at that time. And it's fascinating to go back and to listen to these speeches and hear the Rebbe's comments and insights on the Rambam. And you might be listening during the winter to a comment on the laws that we're studying today, because the cycle is not the perfect 365 of the seasons. And this brings us to section number 2. Now we're going to read the two sichas. Section B is the first, section C is the second. We will go through the two introduction speeches, the two inaugurating speeches that began Mivtza Rambam, learning the Rambam. And let's ask Morris, are you able to read at all? Yes? No? I don't know. Okay, Reb Shmuel, you will start until Morris comes in. Until he's able to come in. Let's go.
An interesting opening. Maimonides begins his preface by citing the verse from Psalms, "Then I shall not be ashamed when I gaze at all your commandments." Why did he choose to begin his preface with these words? It is indeed a nice citation, and it references all the commandments, as does his work. But is there a more fundamental connection between this verse and his Mishnah Torah? An audacious title, the explanation. In his preface, he writes the reason and the purpose for his work. At this time, we have been beset by additional difficulties. Therefore, those explanations, laws, and responsa which the Gaonim composed have become difficult to grasp in our age, and only a select few comprehend these matters in the proper way. Needless to say, there is confusion with regard to the Talmud itself, both the Jerusalem and Babylonian Talmuds, the Sifra, the Sifri, and the Tosefta, for they require a breadth of knowledge. Therefore, I girded my loins, I, Moses, son of Maimon, of Spain. I relied on the rock, blessed be he. I contemplated all these texts and sought to compose a work which would include the conclusions derived from all these texts in clear and concise terms, so that a person will not need another text at all. Rather, this text will be a compilation of the entire oral law, including also the ordinances, customs, and decrees that were enacted from the time of Moses, our teacher, until the completion of the Talmud. Therefore, I have called this text Mishnah Torah, the second to the Torah, with the intent that a person should first study the written law and then study this text and comprehend the entire oral law from it, without having to study any other text between the two. Where did he get the courage? This raises the question, where did Maimonides find the boldness to make such an assertion? Many great Torah scholars wrote compilations and commentaries on the Torah, and not a single one named his book second to the Torah. Where did Maimonides find the courage to compare his work to the written Torah, to the point that one could first study the written law and then study this text and comprehend the entire oral law from it, without having to study any other text between the two? Famously, there was a major controversy when Maimonides publicized his work. Many Torah leaders worried that it would undermine the study of the Talmud. Ultimately, this is not what occurred. To the contrary, Talmud was never studied as widely as it was after the publication of Mishnah Torah. People began to study Talmud even more as they tried to understand the source for the words of Maimonides and so on. I will not be ashamed. To resolve this question, Maimonides begins his work by citing the verse, "That I shall not be ashamed when I gaze at all your commandments." When one approaches the task of writing a compilation which is meant to be a second to the Torah, his first emotion should seemingly be one of shame. How could he possibly be worthy of creating such a compilation? In that light, the verse comes into play. Since the reality is that he, Maimonides, gazed at all your commandments, in other words, he delved into the laws of all the commandments and mastered them, he was compelled to write and disseminate this compilation for the entire Jewish people, giving them the opportunity to master the laws of the Torah as well. He had no other choice. Failing to write this work would mean that he was withholding knowledge. Heaven forbid, transgressing the commandment to love your fellow as yourself, transgressing the commandment to not place a stumbling block before the blind, and violating the Torah's fundamental values. The wording in the verse is precise. I gaze at all your commandments. In other words, he delved into and clarified the laws of every single commandment without omitting a single one. The Torah is called the one Torah, and therefore, if there would be a single mitzvah which was not clear to him, he would not be able to write a compilation about the other commandments either. Therefore, the verse says, I gaze at all your commandments. What is genuine humility? This is obviously not a contradiction to the Jewish value of humility. The Torah says that Moses was the most humble man on the face of the earth. Now, if, as the Talmud says, Moses is true and his Torah is true, he must have recognized his true personal worth, beginning with the fact that he transmitted the Torah from God at Mount Sinai. If the simplest person understands the unbelievable virtue in the person who transmits the Torah from God, Moses himself certainly appreciated this to an even greater extent. Nonetheless, it does not contradict the fact that he was the most humble person. As the Alter Rebbe explains, Moses was humble because he believed that if his spiritual abilities would have been granted to someone else, that individual would have reached a higher spiritual level. Therefore, alongside his humility, being the most humble man on the face of the earth, we find that Moses possesses great strength. When he was approached by a great rabbi named Korach, along with 250 more great rabbis, and they challenged his decisions, Even though he could not defend his own statements from a logical perspective, he did not back down, but rather declared confidently that by morning, God would demonstrate who was right and who was wrong, because he had been following God's instructions. Compelled by reality. The same is true regarding Maimonides, the second Moses, and his compilation of the Mishnah Torah. We first see the author's humility. He knows that his accomplishments are not his own, but rather granted to him by God. Therefore, his opening words are, in the name of God, and he writes in his preference, I relied upon the rock, blessed be he. And he concludes the volume with the words, blessed be God who has assisted us. But he also recognized his own importance, that he had studied the entire Torah and clarified all its laws based on the vast corpus of texts and traditions from the Mishnah and onward. And therefore, it was his obligation to compile the Mishnah Torah and share this knowledge with the Jewish people. That's why he opens with the words, I shall not be ashamed when I gaze at all your commandments. The reality was he had merited to gaze at all of the commandments, and therefore he was not ashamed to write this compilation. He was, in fact, obligated by the Torah itself to do so.
Rabbi Shmuel, that was fantastic. Can you hear the vacuum cleaner in the background?
Yeah.
Is it very, very loud?
No, it's fine.
Okay, so let me try speak a little closer to the mic. This is a fantastic reading. You know, the Rebbe's assumption, the Rebbe's opening, the Rebbe's entrance into the conversation is that, you know, the Maimonides is so awesome and so great. It can't be that he chose to use the specific verse over here for, you know, just at random. There must be depth and high value in this choice. And it turns out that actually every one of the 14 volumes begins with another verse. There's a lot of verses quoted all over the Rambam, but this is the opening verse. This is how the Rambam starts it all. And so the Rebbe is delving into it to find some serious message. And the message that the Rebbe is discovering, and that we can all look for, is that Maimonides is very confident in his writing. He says, "Oh, I've completely understood and completely perceived and covered the depth of the 5 books of Moses. I've got the whole thing here. I'm looking at all of your mitzvahs. I get it all. And given that, I'm confident to do my purpose, which is to transcribe, to write it all down. And as such, nothing to be embarrassed about." So then, maybe this is called the opposite of humility. Maybe we're going to call Rambam out for being a Baal Gaiva. Is it the word pretentious? I don't know. Yes. Okay. So maybe we'll call out the Rambam for being pretentious. And the response is actually, this is humility. Humility means recognizing the blessings that I've got as a person, and that I'm able to use all of those blessings to fulfill the purpose that God has given me. Well, of course, had God invested these energies in someone else, surely that person would do a better job. But in the meanwhile, Hashem gave this to me. And if Hashem gave it to me, this is what I need to do, and let me do it with devotion. I don't have to feel, all big about it. I'm recognizing this is my responsibility. This is what Hashem has given me. And it's with that energy that the Rambam goes forth. And you see how every book begins with B'Shem Hashem Kel Olam, in the name of God, God of the world. And it says in his introduction, he says, "V'nishanti al Atzur Baruch Hu." I'm relying on the rock, blessed be He. So he's Hashem. Rambam is clearly not denying the Hashem in all of this. In fact, he's completely giving it all to Hashem, saying that he recognizes Hashem as the source of all of this energy. With such a conversation, the Rebbe ends introduction 1 to the big mitzvah. But a week later, at the next Farbrengen, the Rebbe speaks about this same verse a second time. And this time there is another lesson for you and I to take home. Morris, are you able to read the text for us? The section C?
Were you ashamed?
Who should be ashamed? Section C. It's page 40.
The Rabbi,
Yeah,
14.
that's right.
You can hear me. Like I said, my service coming
Oh no,
on.
it's
Go
cracking
ahead
up
and start.
completely. Oh gee. Okay, you know what, Morris, we're gonna volunteer Rabbi Shmuel. Okay? I'm sorry.
Okay. The Rebbe. Last week at the gathering, we explained why Maimonides chose to open his work by citing this verse. However, the explanation was only meant as an addition to the literal understanding of the matter, which wasn't mentioned during the talk, due to its simplicity. I assumed that it would be self-understood. However, since it seems that the simple interpretation has been overlooked, we will clarify it now. The verse begins with the word then, implying a future state, which follows a different state of affairs, i.e., after a certain situation, then the situation will change. Then, in this context, refers to the individual who has completed the study of the written Torah and then approaches the compilation of Maimonides. As Maimonides wrote in his introduction, a person should first study the written law and then study this text. When a person has mastered the entire written Torah, but is not yet engaged with the oral tradition, he could feel ashamed. He studied the entire Torah, but he does not know how to fulfill the commandments. Take tefillin as an example. The written Torah says that you shall tie it as a sign on your hand, and it should be for a totafot between your eyes. He doesn't know what or how to tie. He doesn't know what totafot means or where exactly between the eyes and on their head they should be placed. This is true of all commandments. The Torah presents them in a vague, concealed manner. This is the meaning of the verse, then I shall not be ashamed when I gaze at all your commandments. To absolve oneself of this shame, then when one finishes his study of the entire written Torah, the verse tells him to gaze at all your commandments, to study and delve into the details expounded upon in the oral Torah, in this case in Maimonides' Mishnah Torah, and then he will know how to observe the commandments. As mentioned, this is the simple explanation for the verse's relevance as the opening statement of the compilation.
Rabbi Shmuel, that was fantastic. So this second comment from the Rebbe tells us that there's work for you and I to get involved in, right? Oz lo yevosh, then I won't be embarrassed, means that there's a process to this. Start here, end there. Start by reading the written Torah. Start by knowing the 5 books of Moses, and then develop. But at the same time, right? We can't. What are we going like? If we just read the written Torah without knowing the oral Torah too, then we're not really going to understand what Hashem's intentions are. You know, I've met people who insist that they're not going to read any of the commentaries on the Torah, because they just want to know the literal meaning of the text, and they have nearly their own versions of the Torah and Judaism, given that they don't accept on hearing anything else. If we want to know what Hashem's intentions are, well, you know, the tefillin as an example is a prime example. There are all these there are these terms in the Torah which are undefinable. I think Rashi says about toitophois, there's no other such term in the entire in all the Jewish texts. So now what? Like, how do you know what this is? Unless you stick with the oral Torah and ask the oral Torah, what does this mean? Then without that, one can completely go astray. And so there needs to be, you know, the two things going together. So when you've done the oral Torah, then you look into when you've done the written Torah, you look into the oral Torah to understand better what you've just engaged with. and this is the simple meaning of why the Rambam begins his whole book with that line. Well, now is the time. Now we're going to start to review. We're going to review what we know, but we're going to look at it all with the understanding of what it's all meant to mean. Now, why did we choose this topic for this week? What's the connection? Well, there are 3 cycles of studying the Rambam, the way the Rebbe divided it. The first way is learning 1 chapter a day. Sorry, the first way is learning 3 chapters a day. That's the flagship method. You study 3 chapters a day. The second method is to study 1 chapter a day. And the third method actually aligns with the first method. You study from a concise version called the Sefer HaMitzvos, the Book of Mitzvahs, written as well by Maimonides, and it goes along the same track of topics as the 3 chapter per day cycle. So there are 3 cycles: 3 a day, 1 a day, and the Sefer HaMitzvos, the Book of Mitzvahs. Well, next week, Wednesday, will be the conclusion of a full cycle of the 3 chapter a day. And it's a big deal. I think this is going to be the 33rd or so. Maybe it's the 31st or 32nd, the conclusion of the Rambam. I'm not exactly sure. But it's a big moment. It's well beyond 33. It's a big moment for all of us to be concluding the study of the Rambam, concluding the study of the Torah all over again. It's a massive celebration. And then on the next day, we immediately begin to study the Rambam all over again. And so it is my invitation to all of us. Anyone who wants can join in on the party to start learning the Rambam on any one of these cycles, if it's 3 a day, 1 a day, or the Sefer HaMitzvahs. And you can join the party and become a part of this awesome opportunity that at the end of a full year, the entire Torah. It's huge. It's really exciting. Okay, and so my friends, I wish you a good Shabbos. I wish you the best, and I look forward to seeing you with Hashem's help next week.